So there's really an unlimited ways you can use oral history in your classroom. All you really have to do to prepare for this is give them some context, set the stage for the historical event, give them a reading, maybe some lecture videos, a podcast to listen to. And then what I've learned is especially my 9th and 10th graders, they need help generating appropriate interview questions. And I am intrigued because I do think ChatGPT can be a good brainstorming partner in this case. In my case, I've always been kind of afraid that my students are going to ask something inappropriate of a Holocaust survivor when they come into my room, and I want to limit that embarrassing inevitability. So I usually try to give teacher feedback on their questions. I ask the students, in this case, this demonstration product is a story file lesson, and students get to practice asking questions to an AI historical figure. And then I have a couple things here that you'll be able to click on and look at. They can track how many of their questions actually get a good answer. They can code it in here with a 1 for yes or a 0 for no. And this helps me keep track of how accurate are these AI bots. Are they answering the question that the student asked, or are they going off on a tangent? And then finally, I love reflection and I love metacognition. So I've put in some guiding questions from Edutopia on what did the student actually learn from this experience. And so I love this I do, we do, you do sort of model. For this, I used what's called a Freyer model, where the students could practice writing questions. This was them asking questions of a Holocaust survivor. And so I had them create 24 questions, 4 questions for each of the 6 stages of Bloom's taxonomy. I gave them question stems to help them so that this was not a big, difficult problem for them. I love to have them turn and talk with an elbow partner, and they can assess each other's questions and say if that's a good question or maybe not a good question. And I have found that with repeated practice in this area, my students get better and better at asking questions. So here you'll actually see an example. You can go to the Storyfile website and you'll be able to click here and you'll be able to see that they have pre-recorded video testimony from a number of historical figures, whether you want a Pulse nightclub survivor, whether you want a Tulsa massacre survivor, well, you want one of the freedom writers. There's a wide variety of people. In this case, because my students were learning about the Holocaust, we interacted with Rose Schindler, and I asked every kid to pick the best 3 of their questions and ask Rose 3 questions. Here's one.
How can you describe the living conditions in the ghetto?
We were in this oxen-driven wagon. They squeezed in as many people as they could, complete families.
So you can see that Rose attempted to answer the question. The student is going to evaluate whether or not she did a good job, and I kept that, I tracked that on a spreadsheet. But the important piece, I think, is the reflection 1 week later. And one of the things I ask my kids to do at every grade reporting period is sit down with a parent and show them a project that they're proud of. And I hype it up like this is an employable skill. When you're going on job interviews, they're going to say, tell me something you're proud of. And if you can't talk eloquently and convincingly about your own favorite subject yourself, you're probably not going to get the job. So here's the student talking to her mom about this project.
For my world history class, I did the assignment called Holocaust Survivor Questions, where we had to create 24 questions and use the Bloom's taxonomy question starter. There are 6 slides, and on each slide there's a different stage where we have to base off our questions. For example, on the first slide, the first stage is remembering, and we have to ask questions based off what we remembered and understood. And it took me hours to think of questions, but I think it helped me understand the Holocaust better.
The 24 questions you created, did it correspond to another assignment?
Yeah, it did. We had to make 24 questions because for another assignment, we had to record a video of ourselves asking 3 of our questions to a Holocaust survivor.
Do you learn anything from the assignments?
Yeah, I learned that, for example, I learned that Denmark tried to rescue almost an entire population of Jews and succeeded.
So that student had a nice conversation with mom. I loved it. And I would encourage you to put more metacognition into your pedagogy wherever you can, when you're involving the parent in having them talk about what they're learning in school. Oh, it's a win-win. That's the stuff that gets you the Teacher of the Year award. So, and then I do want to say on the third button on this slide, is there a Black Voices collection that Storyfile offers free to the public? It's definitely worthy of perusing, and it's definitely worthy of assigning to your students. So this Storyfile technology essentially is a way where your students can interact with any historical figure, living or dead. And unfortunately, many of these historical figures are no longer with us. So it's a really great technology. I have to credit my wife for telling me about this. She is an avid 60 Minutes viewer, and she saw it on 60 Minutes and she said, "Oh, I think you should use this in your classroom." And I did, and it was a big win.
Today?
I loved it. So that is Storyfile. And of course, they're an ed tech company that's trying to sell a service and make money, but you can also use the free artifacts that they have on their website. And I would encourage you to do so. It helps your students asking better questions, and they like to watch each other's video and see how good were the questions of other people. And you can, if you have time in your classroom to set up a gallery walk like that, it's well worth it. All right, my second AI tool is called TeachFX. And oh my God, do I wish I had this when I was learning how to be a teacher, because I am the Mount St. Helens of talk. I love to talk, and I will drown out anyone trying to jump in and make a point. And TeachFX is this great little app on your cell phone that tells you, this is how much time you spoke, this is how much time the students spoke. It generates these vocabulary word clouds. This is the academic content that your students were talking about. And then my favorite part is it gives you an interactive transcript that looks like a timeline. And you can click anywhere on the timeline and it takes you to the audio in that transcript. So it's very cool. We're not going to watch this video, but you can watch it later. I do want to say that Steve and Dan Fouts, the guys who do the Teach Different podcast, were the people who introduced me to this technology. I am too stupid to find it on my own. They found it. They've been using it with their conversation project, which I urge you to check out. And they had all this data, which just spoke to me as a nerdy doctoral student, that if your students are talking for 2 minutes longer in each class, it increases their test scores by like 14 points. Student discussion is more effective than 94% of the other educational influences, according to John Hattie. I don't know if I believe that, because it seems like most of my student conversations just trail off into nothingness and die a cold, unpleasant death, no matter how I try to keep the ball up in the air and sustain it. So, I do want to disclose a little bit here that before the pandemic, I thought I was a pretty good teacher. And I thought I would get students to have these conversations and to give presentations in class. And that was an area where I excelled, and I was kind of proud of that. After the pandemic, I am useless. I can't get these kids to talk to save my life. I had a depressing moment where 7 kids in a row opted for a 0 instead of standing up and doing a 2-minute presentation. And honestly, it took away my will to live. It made me perhaps reconsider a career as a refrigeration repairman. It was really, really demoralizing. And when I talk to teachers, they're all having that same experience. Kids don't want to talk in groups. They don't want to talk individually. I'm barely lucky if I can get them to turn and talk and sustain a conversation for 60 seconds. So this is from the TeachFX website. My problem of practice is that I don't have good tools to help me evaluate classroom conversations. And if I'm having one and an administrator comes in and says, how are you measuring this conversation? I don't know. And I'm pretty sure it's the same 2 or 3 kids that do all the talking, but I need to track that stuff on a spreadsheet. So the good thing is with this TeachFX app, the AI provides all the insight and all the data about the conversation, and you can kind of reflect on it. So for my first prompt, my first attempt at this, I just asked my students if they could sustain an academic conversation about a book they were reading for 10 minutes. And I introduced the topic, but I wanted them to ping pong back and forth a conversation about this book that they're reading. And I got to give a shout out to my friend Angela Zorn, who is KY Kentucky teacher on Twitter. Angela is God's gift to all things beautiful. She did this graphic that I have stolen and use to front load conversation techniques with my class. And I print this out, I hand it out as a placemat. And I say, when you're having a conversation, these skills are the most important things you can use. I want you to unpack what Peter says. I want you to be able to support what Avery said. I want you to be able to summarize what Bruno said. And I want them to, at some point, get the skills where they can say, oh, Peter, I understand you said this. I like that point, but I'm going to disagree with it here. So these are like conversational moves I'm trying to get my students to take. And it's important to point out that it takes a lot of practice. So thank you, Angela Zorn, for that wonderful contribution. Please credit her if you steal her work and use it. All right, so here's my first word cloud where I asked the students to talk about, they are using the 10 stages of genocide that was published by Edward Stanton, and they are trying to come up with textual evidence of each stage of genocide. In the book, First They Killed My Father, which they're reading about the Cambodian genocide. And I'm leading them to a bigger project where they're comparing the Cambodian genocide to the Holocaust. And I'm kind of doing an experiment right now to see where do I get the most academic content? Is it from their conversations or is it from their quick writes? And so on the left, you see in first They Killed My Father, the capitalists are those who are wealthy. That is a 10-minute quick write where I'm reading these and I'm asking the students to cite page numbers and explain a quote. So it's simple quote, cite, explain format. And what I'm looking for is, can you make a claim? Can you create a line of reasoning? So, but what I like about TeachFX and what they do really well here is they put the words in red are the ones I spoke. They put the words in blue. Those are ones my students spoke. So I can go through that and I can look for content vocabulary that maybe I talked about and see if it's there, or maybe I need to introduce it again after the conversation. So this is one of my favorite reports. It basically says, hey, Petri, the Mount St. Helens of talking. You spoke for 3 minutes. Individual students spoke for 5 minutes. There was about a minute of awkward silence. And then there was some group talk about 7%. So you're supposed to reflect on, well, does this reflect my engagement goals? Or is that enough talking? And I'll tell you, this is really helpful when you start comparing the apples to apples and looking at first period compared to second period compared to first compared to sixth. Because you typically, or in my experience, I'm getting a large variety in talk ratios. So, and this is the timeline I talked about. You can see what I like about this is here I am, I'm talking, I'm setting the stage, and then the individual students start chiming in. And what I love about this is it creates its own transcript. And I can click any point in this timeline and go to the transcript. I can also listen to that section at the same time. So the timeline feature is very good for if I want to say, wow, I asked a good question here. Look at that. They talked for like 2 minutes without me having to prompt them with anything. And they call this a conversational move, a ping pong move, which I think is kind of interesting on the chat, or not the chat GPT, the TeachFX folks. So here's where I think this program is really going to be a game changer and is going to make millions of dollars for the founder of this product and the teachers who adopt it. Because the interactive transcript combines the audio of the discussion with an AI generated text of that discussion. And I'm hopeful that at some point it will know the different students' names. At this point, there's still mistakes. Maybe they're about 95% correct. But when the students know who said what, and they go home and listen to it again on their own, what you can ask your students to do is give me 3 conversational moves you wish you had contributed. How would you clarify something? How would you support something? How could you have summarized Peter's point? And this really gives kids, I think, your introverts a chance to say, oh, I still learned from this conversation, even though I didn't participate in class. So that's where I think there's a real high number of potential. You can also look at this and say, which conversation shows more evidence of learning? And boy, in the head side, all I did for this is I said, okay, we're going to have the same conversation for 10 minutes. I separated the group into heads and tails. Heads went first, tails went second. And boy, you can look at that silence number. My heads group only had 15 minutes of awkward silence where they stared at each other. That second group, tails group, 46% silent. And I'll tell you, those are just killers for me. It's so hard for me to shut up and not say anything. I really, really struggle with that. So I just want to kind of reflect on this main point, which really shocked me, is that research shows the average amount of time students spend talking per hour of class is less than 6 seconds. So if you believe that the people doing the talking are the people doing the learning, TeachFX will help you change your instructional practices. And they have some nice stats here. I'm just starting down the road of trying to get them as a preferred vendor, as an approved vendor in my district, LAUSD. It is not an easy task for those of you on the ed tech side of things. It's hard to get approved and make sure that you're doing everything for every district. I sympathize for you. It's not an easy job. And so one last shout out to Dan and Steve for having me on their Teach Different podcast. If you want to listen to me blather on some more, you can click on that link and go to it. Here's something I have written in the past about listening. And it's just kind of an interesting factoid that students need to leave high school with a working understanding of about 50,000 words in order to be successful. Learning this academic vocabulary, which is all AP is, requires multiple exposures to new words in a variety of contexts. And I salute you AP teachers for pushing that rock up the hill and doing that every day. It's not easy. Right. And for those of you who do highlight listening and speaking instruction, you'll see that our friends on the GMAT typically list this in the top 3 of employable skills they're looking for from people who graduate from business school. So the more you can get your kids talking in class, the better you can get them at allowing them to listen to each other and learn from each other, the better teacher you will be. And I'll just kind of warn you, it's not easy. All right, so here is the bit.ly for the slides. I will throw them in the chat and make them available to you. If you want to see me and my EduProtocols friends, it's here. And I do a social studies show called The Social Studies Show on EduProtocols Plus.
God.
The third Thursday of every
Scott, my friend, we got to move it on here, my friend.
All right. I told you I was the Mount St. Helens of talking. You shouldn't have trusted me.
No, you're great. The FX was something brand new for me. I love that. It was great.